right, and we are now live. Only people you approve can join this room. Well, I have got it so it is posted on our Facebook page. So let's hope everybody's watching it, or my friends and family are watching it on my Facebook page. So
Oh, there you
regardless, they'll learn a little bit more about codes and standards, and then we'll repost it on YouTube. So. Well, welcome to the ICC Region 1 Facebook page. Region 1 was established in 2014, and we are made up of 3 states. That is California, Hawaii, and Nevada. Out of those 3 states, we consist of 32 different ICC chapters. We're dedicated to excellence in education, engagement, to promote a safer environment by bringing individuals together like we are doing today. This is not our first Facebook Live event. This is actually number 4. So we're continuing to build off the momentum that we've already have achieved. This forum was designed to highlight individuals and chapters to make up our region. Today we have Robert Marshall, Fire Marshal with San Mateo Consolidated Fire Department. San Mateo Consolidated Fire Department is a joint powers authority, or JPA, in the state of California, and represents a merger of fire departments from San Mateo, Foster City, and Belmont. I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to thank Robert for joining us today. If you have any questions for Robert, please leave them feel free to leave them in the comment section of the chat. I'll be happy to ask those questions as time goes on, and we'll go from there. Let's see here. And then thank you for joining us. If you would like to be a guest and maybe in an upcoming forum, please let us know. Send me a message. I'd be more than happy to include you. Definitely looking for some counterparts in the state of Hawaii. So some other like-minded code professionals in the state of Hawaii. I'm hoping that maybe we can kind of build off of that, and hopefully we can interview some of those folks as well. So with that, Robert, I want to welcome you to the ICC Region 1 Facebook page.
Well, thanks for having me. Appreciate the invitation, and I'm happy to be here.
Yes. So before we really begin, probably one of the things I want to talk to you first about is your background. I know that you have a very diverse background, anywhere from your aspect of being a fire marshal in San Mateo in the Bay Area, but also code development. So can you please provide us with a background and describe your department and really that area that you serve?
Sure, yeah, happy to do so. So I actually just crossed my 30-year anniversary in fire service.
Wow.
As of June 1st, actually. So yeah, so now I've been in for 30 years, which seems surreal to even consider that. But I started as a volunteer firefighter. And had a completely different career path in mind, actually, at the time. And I had a fire chief who actually had kind of brought me on to take photographs for him. And then it was like, if you're going to be around fire engines, you probably need some training. I'll pay for training if you want to go take the training. And what I didn't realize is that he was an excellent fisherman. And at that point, he was teasing me with the fly, basically. So that just kind of kept going. And then eventually I found myself as a career firefighter. When after about, I don't know, 10 years or so, I had been taking classes and stuff, and I was a firefighter up on the North Coast in Humboldt County, and we had brought somebody up to teach some of the fire officer classes. We kept bringing in different people, but one of the guys we brought in is a name that a lot of people in California know. His name is Bill Green. And Bill Green taught fire prevention 1A and 1B when we still had those courses around. And so when he taught those classes, it really got me to thinking. I was kind of looking at it going, I'm happy to go to fires and I'm happy to go and do all these incidents, but dang, wouldn't it be much better if we could just stop this stuff from happening to begin with? And
Right.
and then I got, kind of involved from that. I kind of got more involved in fire investigation and started looking at, well, how do these things start? And once they do start, what do you do from there? There was another event that happened while I was up there, which was there was it was Firehouse West. It was when Firehouse was offering some of their courses, and the big thing out here in the West Coast, and it was in Sacramento. And I remember coming out from a day of classes at Firehouse World, and there were these guys that were standing out there, and they were handing out flyers, and they were like, "Hey, right across the street is the Sacramento Memorial Auditorium, and we're going to do this special thing. Alan Brunacini
Oh, wow.
and Ronnie Coleman are going to be talking, and they're just going to be talking with each other, and it's going to be, we're calling it Chief Chat. And if you want to hear what these two guys have to say, you should come by." And I was like, well, I like Ronnie Coleman, and I know about Brunacini, but
Right.
who knows, who knows anything about, why would you not want to go see Brunacini, right?
Oh,
So I
exactly.
went in, and I'm sitting there, and I'm having a good old time listening to the two of them talk, which was absolutely amazing,
Oh, yeah.
just to hear those two guys, right?
It would be
Yeah, it was.
amazing to see that on YouTube nowadays. I mean, that type of
Yeah,
chat
that's a good
is amazing.
question. I
Yeah.
wonder if anybody ever recorded that, because it was
Yeah.
fantastic. There was a chief from New Jersey who was part of it too, and I don't remember that poor guy's name. And because I knew the other two, and I think everybody knew, right?
Oh,
They
yeah.
knew the other two.
Yep.
So but I took away, it was another one of those kind of moments where I took away from that talk two things, one from each one of them. Ronnie Coleman at the time was talking very much about data, and
Hmm.
how data, the way that fire service does data, is really poor.
Hmm.
And I remember the example he used. He said, if you go to a police department, they've got a data analyst there, and you could
Yeah.
talk to that data analyst, and you could ask them, "Hey, I've got a bunch of money to give you guys to fight some crime, but in order to get that money, you have to tell me how many left-handed burglars that work between the hours of 3 a.m. and 5 a.m.
Right.
there are." And he said, in about an hour, they can give you that information. They would be able to tell you how many left-hand burglars are stealing
Yep.
stuff between the hours of 3 and 5 a.m. And we can't tell you how many fires we responded to in a year, or how much loss we had, or whatever. So that was the first thing. And the second thing was Brunacini was talking about how he came up through the fire service, and that he always hated the way the rules were, that it was, that kind of, 100 years of tradition unimpeded
Yep.
by progress thing.
Yep.
And he said, right, so he said, if you're in this and you've got all this data and you want to make a change, he said, you can try and make the change, but you're going to run into a lot of headwind. The
Hmm.
best way to make change is that if you see that there's a change that needs to be made, get on the committee that makes the changes. And
Right.
if you do that, you can control a lot about how things are and all of that kind of stuff. So flash forward a few years, I left Humboldt County. I knew that I wanted to become a prevention officer, and I got hired as an inspector with the Daly City Fire Department, which is here
Okay.
in the Bay Area, and worked for them for a while, worked my way up a little bit, actually became a chief of emergency planning and preparedness. So I kind of learned how to become an emergency manager from there.
Hmm.
And then that was getting me too far off into the emergency management world and away from the prevention world that I really, really liked. So,
Right.
I got hired as the deputy fire marshal of Gilroy. And that was about 2008. And anybody who was around in 2008 knows exactly what happened to the economy in 2008.
Hmm.
And I wound up receiving a couple of layoff notices. And while it never actually came to fruition, it was one of those things that was uncomfortable enough that I decided, all right, well, I'm going to go to another fire department. And so I found myself with the Contra Costa County Fire Protection District as an inspector. And that was about 2009 or so, kind of late 2009. So I went there, started as an inspector. I was an inspector and a plan reviewer there. And then while I was doing that, I got my degree in fire science management from American Public University. And then in a couple years in, I tested for a captain's position there, so I became a fire prevention captain.
Okay.
And then the fire marshal moved up in the organization, and I decided I was going to move up too, and so I did. And I was fire marshal for Contra Costa County for about 6 years or so before coming back over to the peninsula that really is my home, and came
Right.
back over to San Mateo Consolidated Fire They were in the process of consolidating at the time, and so I looked at it as a pretty decent challenge.
Hmm.
And one of the cities, as you mentioned, we cover San Mateo, Foster City, and Belmont. And my mom and my grandparents raised my mom in Belmont, so
Okay.
Belmont really is kind of a home for me
Uh-huh.
as well. And I still have family over the peninsula, and I really wanted to kind of do that, and it gave me some opportunities to do some other things because I wasn't going to be quite as busy on day-to-day operations, and I could
Yep.
do more big picture things. And so that's that's what I did. Along the way, I started with the Norcal Fire Prevention Officers Association, which is
Hmm.
an ICC chapter. And there was a member at the time, Ginny Krippner, who was like, "Hey, you ought to start, getting involved in the code committee." And I was like, "Well, what's the code committee? What's that?" And here's Brunacini back in the back of my mind of, "Hey, get on the committee, get on
Yeah.
the committee,
That
get on the
change.
committee."
Yep.
Right? Yeah. So I got involved with the building code committee at her urging. I wanted to be on fire code actually, and she was like, "You're much better at building code. You should do building code." I'm like, I don't know anything about building code." And once I got into it, I realized I actually know more about the building code than I do about the fire code, which is kind of a weird thing. Um, for folks who aren't in California, I don't think a lot of people in the country realize that in California we're unique in that fire officials actually have building code enforcement
Hmm.
authority
Yep.
through Chapter 10, and then kind of a smattering throughout the rest of the code, like the elevator chapter, and here and there through the specific methods of construction and all of that. So I became involved in that, and that's when I started attending code hearings and that kind of thing. And I think it's just like anything else. When you start meeting people, there are some people who will kind of kind of take you under their wing and give you some ideas about things. And Kevin Scott is another one of those guys for
Yeah.
me, where he calls me one day. He had talked to Rocky Abala, who was another guy that was a NorCal guy,
Hmm.
and Rocky had told Kevin to call me, and Kevin calls me and he says, "Hey, there's this new group starting. It's called the Western Regional Work Group of the Fire Code Action Committee, and they need members from kind of all over the western side of the country. So,
Okay.
Rocky gave me your name and said you might be interested in it." And I dabbled a little bit in the code world, obviously. So I was like, "Yeah, okay, that sounds like fun." So I got involved in that. We went to Las Vegas with I think it was 15 of us. A lot of great folks in that
Hmm.
group, and we started to actually write some code stuff. And at first it was kind of like, we were doing it a lot like we do in NorCal with the code committee there, and just talking about stuff and evaluating and that kind of stuff. And then,
Right.
one day somebody said, "Well, is there anything you guys think ought to be in the code?" And we all just kind of sat there and went, "I don't know, maybe." And I had taken a class actually in hood cleaning systems, and
Okay.
the fact that kitchen hoods needed to be cleaned,
Right.
and I'd had the experience of about, I don't know, 5 or 6 fires where hood cleaning was definitely an issue, and we
Hmm.
almost lost a really big business in Contra Costa County over that. And so I was like, well, actually, so there's this standard for kitchen hood cleaning, and maybe we should get that in there. So I had a copy of it with me, and I shared it with everybody, and we started talking about it, and they said, "Hey, that seems like a good idea. Let's do that." And so
Right.
we pursued that, and we got it put into the code in Atlantic City a few years back. And so that exposed me to a whole other world of code development. And then got on the fire and life safety section with the International Association of Fire Chiefs, where I'm treasurer. And they help appoint some of the members to the FCAC directly.
Okay.
And I was asked if I wanted to be on FCAC, and so I found myself on FCAC, thinking that I was going to be going to Chicago a whole bunch to meet with the FCAC, and then
Right.
COVID happened.
Kind of shut things
So
down.
everything was virtual. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So everything was virtual, and I just did what I usually do, which is jump in with both feet and tried to do some good in that realm. And it was really a great experience. I will probably talk more about that in future questions,
Absolutely.
but so that was kind of how I got onto the FCAC, and then through the FCAC or through the Fire and Life Safety section, rather, I was also asked to apply to be on one of the code committees. So I was like, okay, sure. And so I applied to be on the code committees and wound up on the fire code committee. So that too has lent a whole other, a completely different point of view on code development and how code development works and
Oh,
all of
absolutely.
that. So
Yeah. Well, you shared a lot of experiences throughout your career, in that discussion with Bruno and Ronnie Coleman. I mean, I would have liked to have been there. That to me probably would have been a highlight for me. So as we talk about notable experiences, what additional notable experiences have you had that really shaped your perspective on code enforcement? I would think that would have a major impact in regards to maybe, Bruno C's philosophy on just being nice. So many of us, really try to strive and be empathetic and really, and sell fire safety, because we understand that it's a challenge. So what other notable experiences have you had throughout your career that may have, really shaped you as a fire code official?
yeah, there's a lot of stuff, and I think all of us wind up in these different situations that we see, and think about. I think if you're doing it right anyway, I think you do take it home with you. You think about these things that you've seen, and you wonder about, did that have to happen? Could we have prevented this? Is this something that's in a blind spot or whatever?
Right.
So I mean, I think we all get a lot of those kinds of experiences, and so throughout my career, I've had a bunch of those different kinds of experiences. Certainly from just some of the fire fatalities that I've been to, and knowing firsthand in all of those fatalities that one of the major issues was that the fire notification devices, the smoke alarms, had been taken down, or they just weren't present.
Right.
And that was very common. Seeing what excess storage can do. Looking at, and sometimes it's not even your own incidents. I mean, you might see, there was, I think a lot of people remember the San Bruno pipeline fire. And one of the stories that came out of that was a residential care facility, a 6 and less, which has a different classification in California, but still everybody has these small care facilities.
Right.
And when that fire broke out, there was a care facility that was a couple blocks away from the actual pipeline, and there were houses that were burning, and the fire was moving in the direction of this particular care home. And the fire department, it was actually Daly City Fire, that arrived in the area, and they were going door to door, and they'd found that people in that particular building had been left by the staff.
Oh, wow.
The staff just completely abandoned them. And then there were some other, there was a fire down in Southern California that killed some of the residents in these same kinds of facilities. And so, looking at those things and thinking, you know what, it's wrong that, we've got all these other things that we do for really heavy protection. And, kennel facilities, for example, in California, we've had it in there a long time that those need to be fire sprinklered. And now the national codes are starting to catch up on that in the NFPA world. And, it's always struck me as poor that, we're willing to protect Fido, but we're not willing to protect grandma at the same level. And, so you get things like that. And I think that shapes you. Probably the other big thing or series of things that happened to me was there were 5 different occasions when I worked for Contra Costa Fire where I went to an incident as the PIO or as the fire marshal, and I would show up on those scenes, and 5 separate times I was on the scene and I said to myself, wow, that's the biggest incident I will ever be involved in outside of a strike team. Said that 5 times. The last time, I'm pretty sure, is is going to stick. I
Yeah.
think that one's going to stick. There's a possibility, of course, that it wouldn't, but
Right.
knock on, there's got to be some wood around here
Yeah.
somewhere. But I don't think that I'll have another one that big. But we had a very large apartment building, podium construction,
Uh-huh.
under construction, that was set on fire by an arsonist.
Okay.
And it was a complete loss, $55 million loss.
Wow.
I live about 4 miles or so from where this occurred. And when I heard the call come in and they went immediately from the engine, leaving the engine bay, he called a third alarm on the fire.
Holy
And
smokes.
right, so I got up immediately and
Yeah.
I'm en route, and my car is parked right down the street at the fire station that's right down
Right.
the street where my office was at the time. And
Hmm.
I was walking down there and I looked in the general direction and I could see flames, and I'm 4 miles away. So I was like, wow, okay,
Wow.
this is going to be different.
Yeah.
So
Your whole day
we
just
should.
changes.
Oh, my whole next 2 weeks actually
Yeah.
changed. I
Oh
just
my
didn't know
God.
it yet. So so you get something like that, and you're like,
Right.
okay, wow. And so that gave me a pretty unique perspective on buildings under construction that are on
Yep.
fire. Probably the only other thing that absolutely has had the biggest effect on me in my career, and this is another example of it wasn't my fire, but a good friend of mine was the fire marshal for the city of Oakland when the ghost
Hmm.
ship happened.
Yeah.
And so I wound up going to the ghost ship and looking at the ghost ship, and taking a tour through there with the fire marshal about 4 or 5 days after the fire occurred. And boy, I tell you what, man, knowing that 36 people died
Yep.
there, looking at the family. I had a guy come up to me and ask me, he was like, "So you were in there?" And I was like, "Yeah, I was." And he said, "If you don't mind, could I ask you a question?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, you can ask me a question." And he said, "I was wondering if maybe you had any insight into this, but do you think my son suffered when he died?"
Mm.
And it's like, I mean, what do you tell a guy?
Yeah.
What do you tell a family when
Exactly.
something like that occurs? And and especially being a fire professional, that
Yeah.
was something that was preventable.
Yes.
That we
Yep.
can, we can do things that are better. And I'm sure that everybody's seen those incidents, whether it's Ghost Ship or the Station nightclub or
Right.
Beverly Hills Supper Club, or going back even further into the Iroquois Theater, or
Yep. Yep.
Coconut Grove, or we all know about these fires. And it's one thing to read about them in a history book, but to actually see the history unfold firsthand
Yeah.
is definitely going to change you. And it colors everything you do. It colors
Yep.
the decisions you make. And I've changed my approach in a lot of ways through
Hmm.
all of those things. Some of it's great change and some of it's not so great change. But it's change,
Yeah.
and realizing that it's change, and being able to be involved and help make some decisions so that you don't have somebody who asks you whether or not their child suffered.
Yeah.
That it's a really, really important responsibility.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And that's that's so hard, especially on fatality fires,
Hmm.
and knowing that, a lot of them are preventable. And really the simplest thing is a working smoke alarm. And knowing that, I mean, I can share some experiences, and it's just one of those things, anywhere from, having young kids to adults that, all have perished in fires because of a lack of a working smoke alarm. The smoke alarm may have been present, but the batteries were taking out for whatever reason. And I will say that, I like how California has done the sealed battery where you can't do those sorts of things. And especially in those multifamily dwellings, it's very
Hmm.
tough, and it does shape you as a fire code official. So,
Yeah,
you know,
especially in those multifamilies.
yeah,
I mean, that's where I've seen most of my fatalities, in the multifamily dwellings. Certainly in the single families as well,
yep,
but in my whole career, all of the fatalities have been in residential occupancies. I haven't seen a
yeah,
fatality outside of that. So.
yeah. Now that you say that, I'm, thinking back to all mine, and they've all been in multifamily residential. I'm trying to think. I probably have had some in single family, but they've all been residential occupancies.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and I will say I do like the aspect that we now require residential fire sprinklers. I think that those are definitely a life-saving device that many people, I don't say. I really consider that to be one of those devices that may have a bad perception by maybe some different industries, but I do think that they do save lives, and they do typically keep the fire to the room of origin and allow
Mm-hmm.
people to exit in a timely fashion, so that way they aren't a victim.
Yeah, and in fact, that's another one of those experiences that shaped me when I was in Daly City. We had a structure fire that had occurred in a single family residence, and Daly City had residential fire sprinklers since the mid '90s, actually.
Oh wow.
And I think it was the mid '90s. It was a while before it might have been the early '90s, but anyway, so we get this fire over. For those of you familiar with the Bay Area, right over by the Cow Palace. It was within eyeshot of the Cow Palace. And so I was the fire investigator that night, and I showed up. And when I got there, they said, "Hey, something was wrong with the sprinkler system because it didn't go off where the fire was actually mainly at." And I was like, "Oh, okay." So as I walk into the house, I look up, and this is like, I want to say it was like probably 2003, maybe 2004.
Okay.
And I look up and I look at the sprinkler heads, and I'm like, well, those are Omega heads, and those were the heads that were recalled.
Yeah.
So then it was like, okay, that makes some sense as to why it didn't work. So I get in and I go upstairs, and the way the house was configured, there was like this open kind of hallway. It wasn't really a hallway because it was open to the stairs, and it was kind of this like office area. There was a desk in there, and that you see in some of the modern homes, and then there were 3 bedrooms that were kind of off of this, and I think there was a bathroom that was off of that room as well. And there was 1 bedroom that was toast. I mean, you could see there was a lot of fire that had come out of that room. The door had completely burned away. But this room that I was in, this hallway that I was in, had very little fire damage, and all the fire damage that was in there was in the lintel above the door to this one room. And I went into the one room, and I was looking up, and everything had burned away. All the sheetrock was gone.
Right.
Most of the structural members in there had been impinged, and there was the sprinkler head, the Omega head that was there, and it had never activated. But right outside of that room, in that hallway, about maybe, I don't know, 6-7 feet away from that doorway, was a head, and it did fuse, and it did open. And essentially what happened was that single sprinkler head kept the fire in that bedroom. And then when our crews got there, they just went into the room, they darkened it down and put the fire out. But that was another great illustration for me, because that fire was really well advanced. That room had obviously gone to flash over. And while the sprinkler there didn't work, the single sprinkler outside in the hallway prevented damage to the rest of the home.
Wow.
So yeah, it was again one of those things that you see, and it sticks with you. And when you can, and I'm sure you run into this all the time, when you can talk to somebody about what you're doing or what you're requiring from a perspective of, I've been there, I've seen it. It's just such a great way to be able to relay to somebody that you're not just being a bureaucrat who's enforcing a piece of paper. You're looking at it from a thoughtful perspective, and wanting to help somebody.
And, and that's why I think fire investigations is such an essential piece of what we do, because you have to be able to learn from those experiences, because they do shape you, and they do allow you to be more empathetic with those individuals that you're working with, but also too, to be able to articulate your position and express the urgency behind maybe getting some of these things corrected in a timely fashion. Because like you just said, many of us think, or not many of us, but many people think that we are bureaucrats sometimes when we enforce different provisions of the fire code, and maybe forget that the reason why these code provisions are in place are due to those sorts of things that have happened, throughout history. As we talk about fire code, like a lot of times it's legislation through devastation, and we have that devastating event to then enact these codes. And so I think that that's why it's important to have those experiences, because they really do shape you, and really help,
Absolutely.
sell that aspect of fire safety that I think that, we all try to do on a daily basis. So,
Yeah.
you talk about your experience on FCAC and, in the Fire Code Advisory Committee and those sorts of things. So obviously COVID-19 has really shaped and changed a lot of what we've done. So ICC, International Code Council, just made that shift to the committee action hearings. I'm not sure if this is going to continue, but they made them virtual. So serving on that committee, can you provide us with maybe a sneak peek behind the curtain? I saw a lot of different videos that you and Greg Rogers did of the candy drawers and the different break areas. But can you kind of give us your perspective, being part of that committee, how things went, and kind of moving forward, what you think of virtual hearings, and if that's a viable solution to kind of move forward?
Yeah, it was interesting because this was my first time on a committee from that side of the stage, basically, right? So,
Uh-huh.
and it was, I had been to the code hearings quite a bit. My first code hearing was in Minneapolis, and I'd been to pretty much all of them between Minneapolis and this latest one in Illinois. So, I wasn't really sure kind of going into it what to expect. I knew a lot of the players involved. I knew several of the people on the committee. Randy Metz, who was your last interview, he was on that committee. Greg Rogers was on that committee, and so we were we all kind of met the day before. We had had a couple meetings. When you're on the committee, there are some prep meetings that are run. Beth Tubbs was our liaison, and Keith Enstrom, and they both did a fantastic job of preparing us for what we were going to be doing. And Mike Pfeiffer was in on those meetings as well, and he kind of gave us the lowdown, particularly for those of us who were newbies at it, and kind of going at it from that perspective. And then we started those before the hearings actually started at all. That nobody had met yet when I went to the first one, and so then I was, I'm listening, and we're all thinking about how it's going to go, and they're saying, this is how long we think it's going to take, and then of course the hearings themselves actually started, and I think collectively, you're already laughing, but I think collectively we all went, uh-oh.
It may take a little longer than
Whoa.
what we initially
Yeah.
thought. Yeah.
Exactly. So a lot of us on the fire code group, a lot of us were people who were going to be testifying, and so we were seeing kind of how it worked from a testifier's perspective, and
Yeah.
and so we definitely had the benefit of being the last group to go.
Yes.
And so when we all came together, we met for the first night. We all got in to Chicago, and some of us flew into O'Hare, and some of us flew into Midway, but we all wound up, there at in Tinley, right? Tinley, I believe, Tinley Park. That's
Okay.
what it was, is where we were staying. So we all wind up there, and they set up a dinner for us that night. And so we all went out to dinner, and they were like, well, you guys have been watching the code hearings, so you guys know a little bit about what's going on. So before we were telling you you're going to have dinner and the rest of the night off, and we're here to tell you that's not going to happen. Sorry. So we're going to feed you, but you're going to be working late nights so that we can get through this and all of
Right.
that. And then, so we all started talking just there. We all introduced ourselves to one another, and several of us kind of knew each other.
Right.
There were several of us who knew of each other but didn't really know each other. And then
Right.
there were some new people that we met. The North Dakota Fire Marshal, State Fire Marshal, was one of the guys on the committee with us, and nice guy, really nice guy. Really enjoyed getting to know him. And then Jonathan from the, I knew him because I would see him testify at the hearings,
Yep.
but he was with the healthcare committee. And
Okay.
so, then when we were going between ICC headquarters and the hotel, we were in these vans, and we were able to talk to one another. And we actually all kind of wound up like writing with the same people all the time, and
Okay.
either commiserating on the way in or commiserating on the way out, going to and from. And when we first started talking, one of the things that we were saying is, okay, we need to make sure that that we try and get the yes or no answers when we ask questions.
Yes. Yeah.
Try and avoid testifying, or the perception of testifying from the dais,
Yep.
and just try and get through it. And we had all had our assignments, and the one thing that we figured out fairly quickly was when we had gotten our assignments for motions, we had all done our assignments, 100% done our assignments. So we didn't have a lot of dead air. And in fact, if you look at some of the early code change proposals, we were cooking.
Yeah, right there. Yep,
We were cooking through them, and like we were jumping on each other and everything. And then so we got to our first break, and we huddled up in that break room. We're right next to that candy drawer, and that was actually before we knew that was there. They had been withholding it from us, I think. But and probably for good reason, because I can't imagine how hyped up we would have been if we all had sugar highs in that first part. So so we were talking, and they were like, "Hey, settle down. We'll get into a rhythm. Everything will be okay." And so we just started to go. And we would go through a whole bunch, and then we'd hit a controversial run, and it would slow down, and then we'd go through a whole bunch, and we'd hit another controversial run. For the most part, I think a lot of it, one of the things probably that was kind of the biggest change, I think, from having been in a code hearing room as a person who's out there, is that you always, when you're down on the floor and you're watching what the committee is doing, you've got a really good idea about how the committee is leaning, either by watching their body language or listening to the tone of their voice, or you could take a lot more cues from the committee themselves, where I think virtually you did not have that, because there were several times where, like, even in the room that we're in, we're all looking at each other going, don't they understand that we're already going to support this? Why do they keep throwing people up who say, hey, you should vote yes on this? We're ready to make the dang motion. So so settle down, just settle down. So I think that was probably the hardest thing. And then another one of those experiences that we talked about, that are those kinds of things that can change you. When the carbon monoxide one came up,
I was going to talk about
that was a really long one. And with it being so long, and we all knew how that was going to go, because the language wasn't really there. We understood the concept, but the way it was approached was not good, and was never going to get passed. There was no way the membership was ever going to go for that. So I offered up as a member of FCAC. I said, hey, I am willing to, I'm voting no. And I think I may have even made the motion. But I said, I'm against this as it's written.
Right.
I want to commit to you that I'm willing to help you do this.
Yes.
And I had it's one of those things you don't really talk about at the committee level, but I had a friend who died from carbon monoxide poisoning, a close friend. And so it's important to me. It was really important to me, and to try and get it right, knowing that, that there were other states that were doing it. New York and New Jersey, for example, do it. California has a more robust program than what the ICC has in their codes. And we know that it happens. And, there was an event over the weekend, actually, that killed more people in a carbon monoxide incident. And that was in a mobile structure, but still, we know carbon monoxide is one of those things that can kill people. Whether or not we have data on whether or not things are working as intended or whatnot, we just know that it works. And so we went through that process, and we submitted a public comment that is coming in on behalf of FCAC, and I have no idea if it's going to pass or if it's not going to pass, but the one thing that I know is that we had everybody who spoke against the proposal had a seat at the table, and they gave their input, and we crafted things differently based on that input. And we had a lot of really great, a lot of really great interaction, whether it was from industry or the home builders or the fire service,
Yep.
or those poor folks who were all testifying about how they had lost loved ones to carbon
Yeah.
monoxide. We all met and we all came to a consensus within that group. And so now it's going to be up to the big group, and we'll see,
Yeah.
we'll see where that goes. But that kind of stuff is really, really important work, and it's really fulfilling work as well. If it doesn't pass, we'll go back to the drawing board and we'll bring it back again. So I don't think that's the,
Right.
I don't think this is the last we're going to hear of it if it doesn't go in. So,
Yeah.
and there of course be refinements and stuff
Yeah.
too, but.
And I was going to bring up the carbon monoxide, portion of that, and that, the person submitting that, the code change wasn't even really familiar with code, but as we talk about getting involved and trying to affect change, in their capacity, I commend them for that. I really thought that was excellent to try to really affect change. And then when I remember you offering to help them, and I'm glad to hear that that's continuing to move forward, because it is something that needs to be addressed. It is something that needs to continue to be refined. And I hope that, with this latest code adoption, that we'll see it in there, so that way we can move it forward, and hopefully, that's what we try to do, is protect people. And being able to protect people is implementing safety devices that will help them, and I'm hopeful for that. So as we talk about code changes and some of those things, that was a big one that was undertaken and took a long time to talk about. And I will say, I really did like the fire code portion of it, because you guys, you could tell that there was a lighthearted nature about what you were doing. It seemed to be, you seemed to have fun with it. Mark, listening to Mark Sampson and him, kind of moderating the committee, I commend him for that. And it looked like it was fun. It looked like you guys, enjoyed being around each other. It was not a contentious, a lot of times when you present stuff to maybe committees, people get nervous, and it was good to see. You kind of helped help foster that relationship between the proponents and the opponents. And it was, I will say that I did like the virtual piece of it, because one, it allowed me to do it from my couch. And so, as you and I both know, there are late nights in those testifying rooms, and as you could probably talk about being in Chicago and being in having some late nights. It was a lot later for you than it was me, because once it was over, I could hit the button and I could go to sleep. So.
Yeah, it's funny you bring up I could sit on my couch, and that's one of the things. Anybody who is watching the hearings from out there, you guys didn't see who was testifying. You would see their name pop up on the bottom, and you'd hear their voice. And we had a feed in the room that would show us what it was that you guys were seeing. But we also had a couple other TVs in the room, and whoever was speaking, we could actually see them. So if you were sitting on the couch, we could see you sitting on your couch. And if you were, doing, there was one testifier, I won't bring up the name, but there was one testifier who kept getting interruptions, whether it was a child or a dog or a cat. We had a couple of presenters, or a couple of folks who were talking either in support or in opposition to a code change, and a cat would just jump up, and the cat was like, "Yeah, I really don't care about your code proposal, mister," and just block it, or doorbells ringing or whatever. And so it was a really a much different view, because I think it's and I talked about this at the end of the hearings on one of the last ones that I brought forward. But it was really interesting, because you see some of these people, whether it's Marcella Hirschler, who's a fixture in the code change process, or Kevin Scott certainly is another one who's one of those, or Jeff Shapiro, or you see all these guys, and when you're in the code hearing room, that's your impression of who they are. Right. And it's really easy to forget that, hey, they have a life that's outside of this, that they are that, hey, look, Kevin's sitting at his kitchen table and hey, what's that on the shelf next to him? What's that book there? And
Yep.
oh, hey, look, he's got a plaque up on the wall behind him, and
Yep.
it was like that all the time. And I think particularly the ones that were really funny though were as you guys got the disturbance from time to time from the moderator where he'd say, "We can't hear you, you're
Yeah.
muted," and I think that's "you're muted" is probably the one phrase from COVID that nobody ever wants to hear again.
Yeah.
But it
That
was
was on
funny
my
because
bingo card.
right.
I had code action hearing bingo, and I think that gave me a bingo. So
Yeah, and you would see, the funny thing is you would see that, and then invariably what you would see is,
yeah,
can you hear me now? Can
we
And I
can
mean, it
hear
was
you.
just
We can, yeah,
exactly, we
yeah,
can hear you. Go for it. And then that little back and forth and all that.
yeah.
But it was a really fun experience. But I think that actually added a really neat aspect to it that I
Yeah.
didn't expect.
Yeah, and I really do think that the moderators did a great job, because there was a couple seconds where you normally would give testimony, you'd step up to the mic and you would just start speaking and it would be fine. But, typically, you add like 5 to 10 seconds per person getting up to testify. Now, can you hear me? No, I can't hear you. And it's this back and forth.
Hmm.
So it's it's one of those things. And I will say that, towards the end, you could tell that they were getting, it was more comical than anything, because as you said, you would start trying to search on your computer to be able to either turn on your mic or not turn it on, or have interruptions. And so, but I will.
Yeah, well, and we had even had a couple of moderators who hadn't been there before.
Okay.
We had moderators who hadn't been moderators in the virtual world
Okay.
yet. So, so they had a learning curve too. And in fact, a couple of them, when they started, they were actually slowing the process down, whereas the moderators who had been doing it for a while were like, "We can hear you," and then they'd just be quiet, where the other ones would then get into that, that 10-second delay back and
Back and
forth. "We
forth.
can hear
Yeah.
you," and okay, all right, I'm going to start talk. "Can you hear me?" And then, they'd be talking over each other for, 15, 20 seconds.
Yeah, I think that I was guilty of that. I tried not to be. I knew I only had 2 minutes, and I had my stuff out in front of me, and I tried to read it as quickly as I could. And then I look up at the clock. Oh man, 2 minutes is already up, and I think I probably wasted 10 seconds of it trying to be able to figure out my microphone. So
Yeah, you weren't alone.
so we talk about, and I do want to, before we, kind of move on to the next question, I do commend Mike Pfeiffer and his team, because it really kind of seemed to be seamless in a sense. I mean, I think at the end we talked about how many people testified, and how many code changes that went before them. And this was a big block. I mean, this was an enormous block and an enormous challenge. And I really think that they stepped up to the plate and really hit one out of the park. So I hope that
They
there's a
absolutely
virtual
did. Yeah.
component later on. So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, I think that you could definitely make it work. I wouldn't be opposed to being on the committee in a virtual sense
yeah.
in the future. I'm sure not everybody shares that sentiment, but I actually thought there were some advantages to it.
Yeah, me too. So we talk about code changes. So in the midst of the committee action hearings, we had things anywhere from trying to address, things from any, future pandemics, and maybe outdoor seating and those types of things, tall wood buildings. That was a big topic, especially in the building code, and cannabis, and the work that, Todd LaBarge and his folks were trying to do to, with hash oil extraction and manufacturing. What, as we move forward, and in really even solar and electric vehicles, what are some of those areas that maybe you kind of foresee in the future that we might encounter? I mean, maybe a lot of it is anywhere from artificial intelligence and fire suppression systems to something else. But what kind of things do you see maybe coming on the horizon in upcoming code cycles?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and one that I think that a lot of people think about fairly consistently. I think that energy storage systems is going to continue to be one of the things that's at the forefront. We certainly see a lot of technology that's already been developed and is being put into the code, but there's additional technology that's being worked on, and particularly when you get into things that can charge rapidly, and particularly as the automobile market changes, we're going to have more need for that.
Right.
Being that we're from California, everybody knows the challenges that we run into with our electricity providers. And, we've got a fire up in the Paradise area again this year that PG&E has preliminarily said was probably caused by their equipment. And so, looking at alternative power technologies that are safer, particularly when you're talking about wildland urban interface, is going to be something that needs to be at the forefront of the conversation, and we need to figure out, kind of what's going on in that realm. Some other things that I see out there, kind of on the horizon, 3D printing of structures.
Okay.
Is another one. I think it was Sweden just started approving houses that are 3D printed with concrete.
Okay.
And so how do you do that, and how do you, how do you apply code to that? So that's another one. One of the things that we saw a lot of things kind of come about through these last hearings was in relation to the performance code, and that the performance code isn't really a completely usable document. There's a lot of things that need to change in it. And so I think moving forward, performance-based design and performance-based code is absolutely going to be something that's going to come to the forefront, so that we can deal with those things that are kind of the newer technologies and things that we hadn't thought of. Something that I don't know that the rest of the country is really dealing with yet. Certainly the big metro areas are, but we just got our first, as I call it, Uber kitchen. Where you've got these kitchens that are cooking food that you would get at a restaurant, except they're just cooking it in a warehouse, in a kitchen that's been put into this warehouse, and they generate all the food there for things like Uber Eats or Grubhub or one of the other, DoorDash or whoever. And so the one that is going into my city has 34 kitchens and no
Holy smokes.
Yeah, so and when you think about that, I mean, they've got 34 kitchens, which means 34 hoods.
Do
one
they
of
all
the
tie
things
together?
right, and that's exactly it. And so the way they had done their design is they tied two hoods together. So if one goes off, then it'll shut the one across from it off. But as anybody who does kitchen hoods know, you're supposed to shut off the supply air. They only have one supply air source for this building. And that means that if you shut off the supply air, you're shutting it off for 34 kitchens, not 2. And, so there are things that's going to become more prevalent, I believe, because it's a way to cheapen things up so that the companies like DoorDash and Grubhub can make more money. And it doesn't take away from the sit-down restaurants and affecting service in the sit-down places, and people can still go out and enjoy a nice meal there and not have to worry about the 40 orders that were put in before theirs from the from the online apps and whatnot. Exactly. But there are some code issues with that nobody ever really thought of, because I think a lot of people were thinking, well, if you're going to have an F, because that's what it is, it's an F1. And I think a lot of people think, well, if you're going to have an F1, it's really a catering kitchen, and they don't really think about it as 34 individual restaurants. So, So we're going to have to come up with some rules for that make sense and aren't overly onerous, but also make it so that it's safe, because at this point, we haven't had an incident yet, but I can see some problems coming down the line when it comes to that. And then the last thing, and I already kind of alluded to this, but the last thing really is the wildland urban interface portion of things. That we're seeing. I mean, everybody has known for a long time that California is one of those places that just burns every summer. But even for those of us who have been here for, like I said, I just celebrated my 30th year, but I remember the fires before that, and I lived in an area that was fire prone, and would see those things, and I mean I remember the when I first joined the fire service, the Oakland Hills fire,
Yeah.
which is actually, it started not too far from where I live. I drive through it on the way to work every day. But, you know, that was a big deal fire when it occurred. I was in suppression at the time, but there was another fire called the Jones Fire that had burned from basically the south side of Lake Shasta all the way down to Cottonwood, which, if you're familiar with the area, that's a really long distance,
Yeah.
super narrow fire. I think at the widest, the fire was only 3 miles wide, but it burned almost 35 miles long.
Wow.
Because of the wind that was involved. And,
Yep.
you know, and so, and those were both, you know, respectively in the top 10 of California wildfires. And then 2017 happened, and then everybody was like, wow, look at that.
Yeah.
And, you know, 2017 alone knocked those fires way down.
Yep.
I think Oakland Hills was still in the top 10, but the
Yeah.
Jones Fire had been completely removed.
Yep.
And then other big fires like the Rim Fire had been
Yeah.
moved down significantly. You know, and then we were like, wow, man, hope that was an anomaly. And then 2018 happened.
Yeah.
And then 2018, hope that was an anomaly. And then 2019 happened,
Yep.
and 2020. And, you know, we aren't even in traditional fire season in California yet. And already we're,
Yeah. Things are busy.
we're bad. Things
Yeah.
are busy.
Yep.
And I really, really dread when we get to late September, October, and November this year.
Yeah.
Because I don't know how much longer we can keep this up,
Yeah.
but certainly we need to do something about it.
Well, when you talk about doing something about it, you know, one of those things that, you know, in California, we really try. I mean, we do have different, you know, state statutes, Title 14 being one of those, you know, statutes that we use, and it's going through a rewrite right now. But like ICC has the Wildland Urban Interface Code, and you know, I think that that's one of those things. We even have Chapter 7A in the Building Code. We have, you know, Chapter 49 in the Fire Code. I mean, there's a lot of things that we try to do to mitigate it. And so we kind of talked briefly before we started this discussion about the Wildland Urban Interface Code. So how have you guys, you know, started to work with that, and, you know, what have you seen maybe some successes from that?
Yeah, we have actually. So when I started with San Mateo about almost 3 years ago now. And so when I started with San Mateo Consolidated, I had looked at what our wildland risk was, and we've got an area that is designated by the state as what we call a very high fire hazard severity zone, which is possibly the only term that's harder to say than the International Wildland Urban Interface Code. But anyway, so the very high fire hazard severity zones, we've got one in one of the 3 cities that I'm in, and the state is in the process of redoing their mapping, and I'm fairly certain that that zone is going to expand, certainly within the city that already has it, but probably into the neighboring city as well.
Right.
If I'm reading the tea leaves right. And so when I started there, that was one of my big challenges, was to look at what are we doing? How can we affect a change? You know, is what we're doing adequate, or do we need to change it up, or whatever? And so we actually hired an outside consultant to come in and do fuel modeling for us. And,
Oh, okay.
we did it as a much, where the state did it kind of at a 30,000 foot view, we actually lowered the airplane to about 15,000 feet to get a better view. And we actually had some guys on the ground that came in and did some ground surveys of some of our higher fire hazard areas and everything. And so we've actually got a fairly decent fire model now, and a risk model that we're fairly confident with in our area. And so then once we had that, I kind of looked at it and said, okay, what is it that we can do to kind of reduce the risk from a community perspective, and how are we going to do that? And so we kind of undertook this project to do kind of a 3-phased approach. So the first phase was obviously to do the risk assessment, and then communicate the risk assessment out to the different stakeholders, whether that was homeowners groups or neighborhoods or the city councils, or our own fire boards. And so we were able to successfully do that. And then the second phase was to kind of develop an ordinance based on the information that we got and decide how we wanted to do that. And then the last phase of that was going to be education and enforcement. So once we had the ordinance, we'd educate people on the ordinance, what they could do to reduce their risk, and kind of go along that way. Kind of at the same time as all of that, the county undertook a project with a company called Zonehaven, which is a company that specializes in notification for evacuations.
Okay.
And they were kind of born out of the ashes, if you will, of the Paradise campfire in Paradise. And so CAL FIRE kind of headed that up. The county fire unit of CAL FIRE in San Mateo County kind of headed that up, and they started developing this thing, and that became kind of integrated into this as well, so that not only would we have the education piece on here's how you prevent these fires and here's how you protect yourself and your home, but if everything else fails and you need to get out of here quickly, here's what you can do. And so we've configured these zones, and as a portion of kind of teaching people ready, set, go, we're teaching them part of ready is knowing what your zone is and getting registered on these sites that can tell you, hey, you're in an evacuation zone, and go. And the great thing about that is that the software integrates with other pieces of software like Google Maps or Waze, so that if we've got evacuations, Waze knows what routes we're telling people to go.
Oh, wow.
And it will it'll help us to manage some of that, and tell people, route people around the area so that they aren't going there, or route people to the shelters.
Now,
these are all things that we can do with this software.
As part of that software, does and that education piece, are you educating people to use Waze or Apple Maps or Google Maps as part of that, kind of function, so that way they know?
Yeah, we're still really, really early in this, but yes, that's obviously going to be a major component of it. One of the things that we've found is that just through our regular messaging for the groups that are working within the 3 cities, and we have our own Office of Emergency Services that deals specifically with things like CERT and working our EOCs and teaching people how to react in disasters. Because another thing I didn't mention about San Mateo is that 3 miles west of my office is a little itty bitty earthquake fault that probably nobody's ever heard of, named San Andreas.
Yeah.
It is literally right down the street.
Yep.
And so we've always been conscious of the need to evacuate people or relocate people or communicate with the public and everything. So, but one of the things that we found through that was that people needed, in this modern age, they actually need 3 different sources to tell them the same information before they believe it. So, being able to tell them, look, you need to register for these alerts, you need to listen to TV or radio, and follow our social media pages. You need to do all of these things in the hope that they'll look at those 3 things. And certainly telling them that Waze is going to help you get out, or whatever other software we can integrate into that. It's all going to be part and parcel of the same thing. And educating people into what we call know your zone. They can go to community.zonehaven.com and they can put in their address and it'll tell them what zone they're in. And so that company is doing a lot of business throughout California now, and I'm sure it's just a matter of time before they'll be nationwide. But so with the ordinance piece, back to that, I looked at the different ways of doing it, and I thought about, okay, well, I could just, California has Chapter 49, which is all about wildland urban interface.
Right.
How do we do that? And so I thought about just adding a bunch of stuff to that one. And then I was talking with a few different people. And then as part of my time on FCAC, I was actually the FCAC liaison for the Wildland Urban Interface Code changes. And so the work group. And so I got into the Wildland Urban Interface Code, and I started looking at that, and I was like, I could actually just change this. And while it's not perfect, it's a good step, and it's nationally validated, and that was the thing that appealed to me in that regard. So I actually went through and I modified the Wildland Urban Interface Code, put a couple of changes into California's Chapter 49, and then put all the appropriate references to statute into the Wildland Urban Interface Code. Like, for instance, Chapter 5 in the International Code is about construction. and
Yep.
when you're building a house in a wildland urban interface area. Well, we've got Chapter 7A in California that
Yep.
is our version of that chapter. And so I just had to change all the references to there. And that moved me into that realm. And it was a really neat thing. I had been communicating with all of the city councils and with my board. And when it came time to actually vote on it, they all felt comfortable enough that I really didn't get that many questions. They had asked a couple of questions, but we had done a lot of stuff in workshops prior to that.
Okay.
And, just by communicating with the cities and communicating with the city managers and
Yep.
communicating with our homeowners groups, and, they had seen everything that had happened, and particularly from 2020 when we had
Oh yeah.
the
Historic. Yeah. And
historic,
yeah.
and I mean, people who weren't here at the time don't understand about Apocalypse Wednesday, as I call it,
Oh
the
man.
day that
Yeah.
nobody knew. Everybody woke up and said,
You can't see anything
"Oh,
besides. Yeah.
this is
Scary.
different. Why
Yeah.
is the world orange?"
Yeah.
And understanding for the first time why the Mayans might have thought that the gods were angry with them,
Yeah.
and thinking that it was the end of the world. It was easy to see that at that point. And so
Yep.
that was fresh in the minds of everybody. And so I think that probably helps things along. I don't think it's perfect. I know that it's not perfect, but I know enough to know that we're going to modify it too. So
It's
so
the first
we'll
kind of iteration. You and I both know that
exactly.
it's going to take time for it to, kind of gel and come together. So
Exactly. And then it kind of ties back to Ronnie Coleman. We're
yeah.
going to be looking at the data.
Yep.
We're going to pay attention to what the data tells us about what we're doing, and is it effective, and is it cost effective,
Yeah.
and looking at all of those things, not just well, we need to prevent fire.
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
about that. These
Yep.
are, like I've said before, these are real people with real lives and real things that they need to do.
Yep.
And I don't want to cause them to spend a bunch of money that they don't have to. But I also don't want our neighborhoods burning down, because that can have a much longer lasting economic impact.
Yeah, and I wasn't gonna. I don't have this on my list of questions, but I kind of do want to ask it, because you really, how you just described all that. That's really, as we talk about fire prevention is no longer really fire prevention per se.
Mm-hmm.
As you and I both know, that we're now community risk reduction departments or divisions of many of our fire departments. And although you did that risk analysis, identifying, and you kind of walked us through really what community risk reduction is. And I think that that's something for, fire code officials that aren't familiar with community risk reduction, to identify what that risk truly is, being able to implement strategies to address that risk. And as you talked about, the ordinance and then education along with, but you were doing education even before the ordinance, before it was adopted, through workshops and those sorts of things. So I think that that's essential to be able to really affect change in the overall community. And even as you talk about the San Andreas fault, I felt my first earthquake. I've lived in California now for 6 years. I felt my first earthquake, 2 weeks ago? And
Yeah.
I thought somebody was pushing my chair. I didn't know what was going on. And it was kind of an eye-opening experience for me.
Yeah, that was, I hadn't felt an earthquake that strong in a couple of years. So,
Yeah.
and I felt it, I was at home at the time, and yeah, I was like, uh-oh, that's not good, And then I
So
found out how far away it was.
yeah, that was clear up in, up by Markleyville, where they have a
Yeah,
big fire going
I was
on
to say
right
where they've
now.
got the fire going on right now.
Yeah. So we talk about community risk reduction. So as you've done that with Wildland and the urban interface, what other kind of community risk reduction things are you implementing within your jurisdiction?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you're absolutely right. Community risk reduction is the way of the future, and we've been calling ourselves a community risk reduction division now for the 3 years that I've been with San Mateo
Mhm.
Consolidated. So, but I think the big challenges are trying to do the day-to-day stuff.
Yeah.
Certainly in California, we have the mandated inspections that we're
Yep.
trying to do, and then just all the normal day-to-day stuff. You lose an inspector, you need to have a hiring process. Somebody
Yep.
retires, you'd have to have another hiring process, and then trying to do all these things where you're going down the road to the community risk reduction route.
Yep.
Like I mentioned, we've got an OES division, and one of the people in that division is responsible for our community emergency response teams, or CERT,
Okay.
as most people know
Yep.
them. So we do a lot of outreach through the CERT programs. in that regard. And we take care of a lot of other things through there, like fall programs and that kind of thing. What we are doing, and right now it's just kind of a hodgepodge, but what we are doing is we're going to be undertaking a community risk analysis
Okay.
done in conjunction with NFPA 1300,
Oh,
which is
wow.
the standard on CRAs. And so we're going to have an outside agency come in and run that CRA for us.
Okay.
And hopefully that's going to help us do that. And then what my hope is from there is that we'll run a NFPA 1730 analysis, which is for those of you who are familiar with 1710, the standards of cover document.
Uh-huh.
1730 is standards of cover for community risk reduction, essentially.
Hmm.
So once we get that CRA, we'll be able to actually kind of walk down that road and see, what it is to be right-sized, what kind of programs we need to be offering.
Yep.
We certainly know that the wildland portion is probably our biggest risk,
Right.
but earthquakes are certainly a big risk as well.
Yep.
Aging communities are a big risk. Sea level rise due to
Climate
just the
change. And,
climate change
yep.
stuff. All of those things are going to be really important for us to address. And we've got some ways to address some of those things, whether it's through our community's general plans or specific plans for development and working with our planning divisions. Doing things like local hazard mitigation plans certainly have given us a great insight into all of those things. And now it's really going to be kind of bringing all those things together in a single document so we can kind of plan the future and appropriately move forward from there. So
I'll be interested to see how that community risk analysis comes out. I think about that too. Like, I think, okay, well, I can take this on myself and try to figure it out. But it's just so big, for it to be able to do a jurisdictional wide analysis is a big challenge. And I mean, you took a very focused approach because you recognize the need with the wildland urban interface and that response, but also too now looking at it globally from throughout those the entire area that you serve. I think that that's great, and I'll be interested, and I'll probably likely follow in your footsteps because I think that that's something, as you mentioned, we're also labeled community risk reduction division as well. But I think that, as you mentioned, doing all the day-to-day, we have to do all the day-to-day. And sometimes some of those higher level things and programs that we need to be implementing are difficult because you are trying to do anywhere from state mandates to operational fire permits, new construction permits, and those types of things. So
yeah.
I do think that that's one of those bigger challenges and I commend you for it because that's awesome. To hear that you guys are doing that risk analysis, I'm kind of jealous, to be honest with you. So
one of the things that I when I was kind of contemplating, do we want to do it with that or do I want to do it myself or whatever?
yeah,
And one of the things that occurred to me is I try to know what my blind spots are, but I don't know what all of my blind spots are. And
right.
particularly because I've only been with this community in this role for 3 years,
Uh-huh.
I thought, there's a lot of history that I don't know. I know what the current history is, and I know what the current issues are, but there may be some issues that I don't understand that I haven't realized, or that somebody else might have a better idea, or might think it's a bigger problem than I think it is. And so then I started to think about that in terms of underserved communities, for example, and how much I don't know about our communities. And I thought,
Right.
do I know how to do it? Yeah, I know how to do it, but maybe I can have somebody else come in and look at this with an unbiased eye and
Right.
not go, because no matter how good you are, I think that, you're always going to run into those situations where you're like, man, I should have seen that.
Yeah.
And if I can have somebody else look at this and they say, hey, wow, look what we saw. And then I can go, man, I'm glad you saw that because I should have seen that,
Yeah.
and to be able to act on that. I think is important, and they'll know all the right people to get involved and
Yep.
all that kind of stuff. So, and the other good thing about that is a couple of my neighboring agencies are going to enter into the same agreement with the same
Okay.
company,
Okay.
and so they're going to be doing that, and so we're all going to have a community risk assessment, and particularly because we have a drop boundary agreement in the county for response purposes, and so having having an idea of what our neighbors' risks are because our people might be responding to them, and that kind of thing. So yeah, I think it's important.
Well, I'm going to follow that closely because I kind of want to do the same thing, but well, not kind of. I do want to do the same thing, but as it takes resources, it's definitely something I'm going to have to take a look at, and knowing that there are companies out there to really help foster that and be able to help develop those plans. Because every time I get, I take a look at the standard 1300 and say, okay, I've got this, I know this, and then you start the process and you start, I immediately feel overwhelmed. Like, okay, wait a minute. As you mentioned, trying to find those blind spots. Am I capturing everything? And
Right.
and that's my bigger concern is I want to make sure that we do capture everything. And as we do strategic planning and identify, hey, what are some strategies we can put in place to be able to identify those? And does that mean that I need to double my division to be able to address
Absolutely.
that?
Yeah.
So we talk about, I mean, you kind of hit on it, and I kind of wanted to talk about it a little bit more as your work with that Wildland Urban Interface and developing the ordinance, all the community meetings that you had. As you and I know that, partnerships are key in developing, trying to advance these safety initiatives. So how do you work on building those those partnerships, through that code development process and really trying to sell fire safety out to the rest of the community?
Yeah, that's probably one of the biggest challenges that I generally have is just trying to get the message out to the community on the different things that we're doing and that we're trying to accomplish. In this particular case, my biggest ally was actually one of the city councils, the one that had the biggest fire risk, because they had a very involved council who was very involved in the community, and they each had big Twitter followings and big Facebook followings of people in their community, and then figuring out who in each of the cities were kind of the people who were the community outreach people that
Uh-huh.
already had established relationships, and talking to them about, look, this is what I'm trying to do, this is who I'm trying to reach, do you have any suggestions? I know that a lot of people in our business look at uh, uh, one particular, I'm going to say the word and everybody's going to go, oh, no, not that. But Nextdoor
Yeah.
is, I mean, it's a dual-edged sword, and I think
Yes.
we've all got experiences on both sides of Nextdoor.
Yep.
But the great thing about Nextdoor was that it actually allows you to really, if you set it up, it allows you to really specifically target neighborhoods for a specific problem.
Uh-huh.
And that was one of the things that was invaluable to us. And a couple of the communications managers for the cities were kind of instrumental in getting those things out to the right people. And then that would lead to a phone call, and a phone call would lead to a conversation with a maybe an HOA board, and that would lead to a meeting with the community at large, and they would publicize it. And I made some good partnerships in one of our neighborhoods where they had a person on their board who was a printer by trade, and
Okay.
he printed up a bunch of signs and put them all up, and it didn't cost us anything. He put it all up and said, hey, the fire department is willing to come out and talk. Here's when it's going to be. And hey, the fire department is willing to come out and do an evaluation of your property free of charge. And hey, when they do this evaluation, they aren't going to enforce on you. This isn't an enforcement situation. This is
Right.
how can you protect your home?
Yeah.
And so I think when you approach it kind of incrementally that way, I think that is a much better way to go. And certainly, I mean, you hear things that you wouldn't necessarily hear otherwise. So,
Uh-huh.
when I was going out to these homeowners groups, one of the big concerns with them was, okay, well, you're going to go out and you're going to tell people what to do. How are you going to force them to do it? How is
Hmm.
that going to work? And then I talked about, and I've had this experience before, where we go out and we do the inspections and we give you a couple warnings. And if you don't heed the warnings, we're going to hire somebody to go do it. And then
Yeah.
we're going to charge you for it. And if you don't pay up, then we're going to put a tax lien on your property.
Yep.
And, I mean, certainly I don't like to be that guy.
Right.
But the flip side is you're talking about community protection here, and that
Yeah.
you need to do something because one person can make a difference, but that's both positive and negative. You don't
Yeah.
want the one person to have that negative influence on
Right.
the community and burn down a whole neighborhood because they didn't clean it up. So, so we started looking at that, and everybody was like, yeah, rah, rah, go, that's good. And then somebody said, You know, Mrs. O'Leary and her cow lived down the street. You may have heard of them once upon a time. And, you know, she doesn't have a lot of money. And
Right.
I don't know that she could pay somebody to come out and do it.
Right.
And she's 80 years old, and you don't want her out on the hillside trying to cut those weeds herself.
Correct.
So
Yeah.
how are you going to address that? And so that led into more conversations about how would we address that,
Yep.
and were there ways that we could do that. So we actually have applied for a grant for seed money for a fund for low income people to
Okay.
abate their weeds for them. So you know, they haven't started to award that money yet, but that's, you know, that's one of those things that is important. It's a
Yeah.
way to include the entire community. And that was, you know, going back to that blind spot thing, that was one of those blind spots that I didn't really think about. I mean, the neighborhood where where this particular wildland threat is, the low end homes in this neighborhood are $2.9 million,
The low end.
right? The
Wow.
low end, right? And I mean,
Wow.
it's San Francisco Bay Area real estate is
Yeah.
part of it, but I
Yeah.
mean, literally from this hilltop, you can see the entire bay. I can see Mount Diablo, which is only a few miles away from my home here,
Wow.
and you know, you can, on a clear day from up there, you can literally see forever.
Yeah.
So you know, when you think about that, it's kind of weird to think that somebody who owns a $2.9 million house wouldn't be able to afford to cut their weeds. But
Right.
you know, they bought their houses when they were $140,000.
Yeah.
So you know,
Yeah.
then it's like, okay, well, that's, you know, that's one of those blind spots for
Yep.
me. And so, you know,
Yep.
trying to look at all that stuff, that was really super important. And really, it all started with communication with my elected officials and with the key people within the cities, and that gave me the, you know, the ability to open those doors with those community groups and individuals within those groups.
Wow. That, I mean, and that's kind of one of those things that you just kind of pull on a thread. And as you keep pulling on that thread, it just keeps coming, and you try to address it. I worked for Colorado Springs fire for 3 or 4 years, several years ago. And as we talk about, fuel mitigation, Christina Randall, she was great. She was she headed the Wildland, kind of division of the fire department within the fire marshal's division, or fire prevention division. And they had fuel reduction teams. And so through grant funding, they were able to go around and, and address some of these areas, kind of like what you said. Now, we didn't have the dry weeds in Colorado like what we have here in California. It's a much different vegetation. But yeah, it was kind of, it was interesting because they had kids, and I say kids, they were, college interns that would, spend the summers, and they had grant funding to go around and mitigate these fuels. And it was interesting to see. And they did, do a lot of like the fuel moistures, and they would send out fuel moistures every day. It was an interesting, good experience for me to kind of learn from that and see that. And it sounds like you
Oh
guys
yeah.
are on your way to that as well.
Yeah, my next challenge really is to get the cities, their public works or their parks departments involved in the process, and
Uh-huh.
getting them attuned to what it looks like, because in the one city in particular, a lot of the land that's problematic is actually owned by the city. And so, it's starting to make those connections with
Yeah.
them and saying,
Yep.
look, here's the deal is I'm going to start telling these people that they need to clear their lawns and clear their backyards and cut their trees and everything. And right up against their property is your property.
Yep.
And so if I'm telling them that they're going to have to do this, guess whose door they're coming knocking on next?
Yep.
And I don't want to be the bad guy to you guys because I'm your fire marshal,
Right.
but don't put me in the position where I have to publicly shame you either, and try and do that. And that actually led to a really interesting conversation with the one city about they've got a couple of parks that are these big wide open spaces, and they're beautiful. They're absolutely stunning when they're particularly in the spring. But there's a lot of undergrowth in them, and a lot of stuff that never should have been there to begin with, a lot of invasive species. And so now it's actually turned from a conversation about fire risk reduction into a conversation about habitat restoration, and looking at that, and removing the non-native species and replacing it with native species, and restoring oak woodlands to the way that California used to be in that area.
Right.
And having some of the native flowers and the native plants, and and all of the stuff that actually overall reduces fire risk because the native stuff actually doesn't burn all that well.
Exactly.
So, you know,
Yep.
when you get rid of eucalyptus trees and replace them with oak trees or redwood trees or, you know, what have you, it just works out better for everybody.
Right.
And that actually gained a lot of traction with the community as well. Because when I first started saying, yeah, you're going to have to cut this stuff back, and you know, somebody was like, well, what about the, you know, the red salamander or,
Yeah.
you know, what have you?
Yep. Yep.
You know, then you start talking about that, and you know, you think about it as this holistic approach. And even though that's not my primary focus, it's still something that's important to me.
Yep.
And you know, again, a blind spot. I didn't think the community was going to care about that, but
Yeah.
turns out they do. And it's a really good tool to be able to sell what it is that we're trying to do to reduce the overall risk.
You know, and I know that this, you know, we're using this forum as an ICC forum, but, you know, it kind of reminds me of the NFPA ecosystem, or how they've kind of shown the different gears. I mean, I really think that that's one of those things, that there are different things that we all have to kind of keep in mind as we're, you know, doing these, you know, different initiatives. And I think that that's a good example, really good example, how, you know, really, you know, fuel modifications turns into, you know, a conservation effort as well. So
Yeah, and that's, you know, we talked a little bit about the future of the codes earlier, and you know, another good example there that was in this past code cycle and will be in future code cycles is the A2l refrigerants.
uh-huh.
And you know, that's actually exactly the opposite. The A2l refrigerants are there because they're low chlorofluorocarbon,
Yep.
low carbon emission fluids, and so you know, that was a thing where, you know, they said, hey, look, that was born out of California. The California Air Resources Board and
Yep.
Cal EPA all said, hey, we need to reduce carbon emissions, and reducing it by changing out these refrigerants is a good way to do that. And so now when you have those kinds of initiatives, they're going to change the code. And so I think the more we can think about, you know, when we get into these code discussions about what is the effect on the environment and can
Right.
we do things to make the environment better, I think there's certainly room in the conversation for that.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, yeah, you know, and that's probably more of a blind spot for me than anything, because you know, I'm more, I don't want to say we a lot of times we work in silos, and you know, maybe I have a more of a myopic view as it relates back to, you know, the just really fire related response and those things that we find in the code. So,
Mm-hmm.
Robert, I have one last question, and you know, you've been extremely gracious with your time. You know, we've gone almost an hour and a half, and so
Oh, geez.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask this question, because, as I mentioned, we're part of ICC. How do you engage with the International Code Council? You kind of talked about your, you know, being on the committee, but how do you engage with the International Code Council?
You know, I try to engage myself in a lot of different ways, really. I mean, I pay attention to things like this. You know, certainly participating in things like the Fire Service Membership Council
Hmm.
is another great way to get involved. You know, when I was president of the Norcal Fire Prevention Officers, we were an ICC chapter, and that really opened my eyes to the bigger kind of, as you mentioned, the ICC ecosystem. You know, there were a lot of things that I didn't know about. I had
Hmm.
never been to an Ed Week before that. I had never been to the they were going on when I was at the code hearings, but I'd never been to the annual business meeting
Hmm.
or paid attention to what was going on with that. And so I think getting involved in those things, and then you know, when you know, one of the things that we do at both NorCal and SoCal FPOs is we have the folks who are involved from ICC who come and give us reports about
Yep.
things that are going on, and certainly I've made connections that way and started talking to people, and it's led to some really great friendships, but also some really great partnerships.
Hmm.
You know, through the FCAC. And through the Western Regional Work Group, I became involved with and met Carl Fippinger and his predecessor, Rob Neal,
Hmm.
who I actually knew from his days at the National Fire Academy.
Yeah.
And you know, you start learning about some of these people, and you know, you just start talking with them, and you know, I mean, Carl and I mean, okay, Carl's the, you know, he's the big ICC guy. And, okay, you know, what does that mean exactly? And, you know, we would sit there and we would talk at dinners at, you know, different functions and stuff, and we became friends. We're both huge baseball fans, so we always talk about
Okay.
baseball, for example. and then it was like, he hears something, and so he calls me and he says, hey, I heard this out of Northern California. Have you heard anything about this? Do you have any advice for me on how I can approach this kind of a problem or whatever?
Uh-huh.
And then vice versa. When I was looking at doing the International Wildland Urban Interface Code for my jurisdiction, I called him and I talked through some of the things that I was going to do. And, so engaging with the people who are there is certainly something. And then, I think we say this a lot in our business, but, just getting involved in all of these things while I may not be interacting with an ICC person directly,
Yep.
ICC has connected me with so many people that I never would have connected with
Yeah.
otherwise, that I can call and I can ask questions on something that I haven't dealt with. If I have an energy storage system question, I can get in touch with Howard Hopper from Underwriters Laboratories or Bob
Yep.
Davidson from Davidson Code Concepts. And, I can talk to them about these things and get the information from them. And there's a lot of folks that are my friends now that, I met because of the code issues or the code,
Yep.
going to the code hearings or whatever. And, I've got both a professional and a personal relationship with them now. And, and I get those calls and,
Yeah.
I think that's one of the craziest things is, you've got all these people who, they've been the people that you've looked up to. And then one day they're like, hey,
They're calling you.
can I ask you a question? Because I think you might know something about this. And you're like, I don't know anything, dude. I don't know why you're calling me because I know nothing. Colonel Klink. Now I'm aging myself, but I know nothing.
Well,
So,
I think I've been one of those people that have called you and said, hey, I got this issue. I'm not quite sure how to handle it. Can you walk me through it? Because there are definitely some unique circumstances. So
there are, yeah.
So
Yeah.
you are my
yeah.
phone.
And I made a phone a friend this morning actually on an issue that I'm having, and I called 4 people myself and just said, hey, what do you think about this? And reached out to another group that was a little bit bigger group and asked them the same question. And it really is critically important. And I think that's one of the biggest things about, you get involved with ICC, but it opens up all these other doors. And
Yep.
I don't know that everybody understands that.
Well, no, and I agree with you. And that I can share an experience. I just had a code issue and I'm still working through it. It's one of those things that hasn't quite gotten resolved yet. But talking to Bruce Johnson with UL and John Tacker and those folks, and then communicating elsewhere with other people, that it's good to have a phone a friend, especially when you encounter strange issues that the code is sometimes not exactly very clear and ambiguous maybe sometimes, and for that sometimes it's important to try to at least identify what the intent is. And so it was good to be able to talk to those folks and be able to have a conversation and be kind of on the same footing, and them maybe know who you are instead of just calling them out of the blue like, how did you get this number? I don't know who you are, but so it's good to have those those people that you can talk to.
The other thing that's really interesting about making those connections too is that once in a while somebody will call me and they will say, hey, this is who I am and you've never met me before, but I have this issue, and I was talking with Bruce Johnson at UL, and he suggested that I call you because you might have some insight, and it's in a jurisdiction near you, or I've even had it happen a couple times where it's in my jurisdiction, and they're like, you really ought to call the fire marshal. He's not as mean as everybody says he is. He's mean, but he's just not that mean, So, that too has proven invaluable. Just as an example, there's a gentleman here in California that a lot of code people have probably heard of. His name is Steve Wankel. And Steve is very involved in the code process. And, he testified at the code hearings this year and had a lot of great things to say and a lot of great things to bring up. And there was an issue with one of my building departments where they were being a little overzealous on a particular issue. And really it was a fire issue. So they referred it to me, and I start looking at the email chain, and I see that Steve Wenkel is on there. And in California, Steve is a big name because he
Yeah.
was the head of the Building Standards Commission, which is the commission that adopts our codes for us.
Right.
And so, we go through this whole thing, and I just shot him an email, and I just said, hey, sorry you had to go through this. I agree with your interpretation of this. I've told them that this is our interpretation of it. So you'll be getting a notice from them about this, and everything's okay. Feel free to reach out to me in the future. And so, and we both identified now that there's this issue because the code is kind of silent in this one area.
Yeah.
And so now we're going to try and go forward with the California amendment because it's going to come sooner than the next ICC code cycle. But then we're going to try and change it and clarify it, really, not really change it, but clarify the issue in the international code. And so it's weird. It's all, it's all a web.
Yeah.
It
And
really
that's,
is a web.
yeah, exactly. And, and I really, I think about it more, I grew up in the Midwest. I moved, I worked in the state of Iowa for a brief time. So, when we were kind of in a group with, Ray Reynolds, he was in that group. I remember Ray
The
was
king
my
of
boss.
valet trash.
Yeah, he was my boss. And so,
oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was my boss for a while before I started moving further and further west. I moved to Colorado and then came to California. But a lot of times I looked at Colorado and IFSTA and Brett Lacey and their work in there, and then also California is really kind of the leaders in code development. And so now to be part of it and know who I can contact, contact it, like I'm not alone. I'm not on an island, and that's one of the things that I enjoy the most, because sometimes as code officials, we take some very unpopular positions, and
absolutely.
And so when you take that unpopular position, you want to know that when you call that lifeline, that you're not on the island and by yourself and nobody's agreeing with you. So
absolutely, yeah. I had that experience when I was deputy fire marshal with the city of Gilroy, and the fire marshal took a vacation on the 4th of July, and for the whole week of 4th of July. And 3 days before the 4th of July, one of the council members called an emergency council meeting to ban fireworks. And wanted me as their star witness. And,
no.
Yeah, talk about feeling alone on the island.
Yeah, I've been there. Maybe not that degree, but I've been there. Well, Robert, I appreciate your time. We've talked. I could probably continue to talk to you, but I know you're busy, and I don't want to take up your whole evening. And I hope that everybody that has kind of tuned in, we've had some people kind of come and go, but I'll post this discussion on YouTube, and we'll share it amongst everybody else. But I think that this was very enlightening, anywhere from ICC and the code development process, and even community risk reduction and the enforcement and interpretation of codes. I mean, this has been a great conversation, and I think it's really invaluable, and I hope more people can tune in and kind of learn, and as I mentioned before, really that's part of what we try to do here with ICC Region 1 is that engagement. So hopefully we can get more people involved in this process. So if you have any suggestions for people for me to reach out to, please share them. I'll be more than happy.
Absolutely will.
Yeah, I knew you, and I was like, I'm going to call Robert. I think he would be the good next addition. We had Randy Metz before, and so I did. Maybe I should have had both of you on at the same time. I'm sure that would have been interesting.
Kind of like oil and water. I'm not sure it was a good idea.
maybe we can do a round table. So, but yes, I appreciate it. For everybody else, if you have, I'm looking at the questions. Let me go one more stop here. I do not see any questions from. I'll check the LinkedIn page because I did post something there too. Let's see if anybody else has posted a question. Nope, I think we're good there, and we are good on Facebook. So
excellent.
Yeah, so but if you have if anybody has any further follow-up questions, I know where Robert is. I can send him a message. So, or you probably know him as well. We're all together.
Say, I'm happy to talk to anybody that'll listen. Really.
Yeah. So, but Robert, I do appreciate it. This has been great. I really enjoyed
thank
it.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it as well.
Yeah. So have a good evening. And if there's anything I can do to kind of reciprocate this, this discussion,
Oh,
please let me
you're on the list.
know. That's okay. I totally understand. So, but all right,
Excellent.
Robert, have a good
All
evening.
right.
And again, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for the invitation.
All right. Have a good night.
You too. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.